welcome to the show. Should Fiji be included in the Trans-Tasman Bubble? This is the subject of discussion tonight, and joining us on the show is the Australian High Commissioner to Fiji, His Excellency Mr. John Feakes. So thank you for joining us this evening.
Thanks, Ziad.
So let's talk about this Trans-Tasman Bubble. For someone sitting at home, for ordinary Fijians who may not be aware, could you explain to us in a few words what this bubble is?
Well, the Trans-Tasman Bubble is really just a COVID-safe travel arrangement to facilitate travel between Australia and New Zealand in a manner that protects the public health of both countries. We're at the very beginning of discussions with the New Zealand government about what that might look like, and there's an enormous amount of preparatory work to get it up and running. But obviously it's important for us, given the importance of the New Zealand economy to Australia and Australia's economy to New Zealand, and the number of Australians who live in New Zealand and vice versa, that we open this up. But we'll be guided throughout by public health concerns, because the last thing anyone wants to do is to have a travel arrangement which allows a second wave of infections in either country.
Mm-hmm. So when we're talking about this, I understand you said that there's quite a lot of preparatory work that is, you know, in this particular stage. Of course, there may be different models, different, fallback options that you need to look at. But when one hears the word, there's a travel bubble, instantly one thinks of their own personal gain. You know, am I going to be able to travel for personal reasons? Is it for business reasons? Is it only for diplomatic reasons? What's the priority right now?
I think once travel between two countries is opened up, or three countries, it will mean any travel, so business travel, personal travel, government travel, and above all, tourist travel.
So with everything that's going on with the pandemic, and we're seeing on international news the way the Australian government is responding and its measures. So in all of this, how much of a priority is finalising this agreement?
Well, it's a big priority for Australia and New Zealand, and it will become a priority for Australia, New Zealand and Fiji down the track. And I need to be cautious about this. This is several months away, and as I said, there's a lot of work to be done. But we absolutely recognise that the importance of a return of Australian and New Zealand tourists to Fiji and to Fiji's economic recovery. So that's front and centre in our minds.
I mean, so the reason why I would like to get into this is because reopening borders is something that is it's subject to a lot of debate, especially on local social media. As soon as news broke of this, that there were talks happening, you see reactions on either side. And talk to us about the effect that COVID-19 has had after Australia shut its borders. Has that affected you in such a way that this became a priority?
Well, closing your borders has had an obvious effect. Closing our borders has had an obvious effect. But it's also been the means by which we and Fiji have been able to contain the virus. And those countries which moved decisively and quickly to close their borders are those which will emerge more quickly from COVID-19, and so the economic recovery will be quicker. Those countries which didn't close their borders, in many cases, are having a much more severe experience with COVID-19.
So besides all of the, for example, for Fiji, besides all of the obvious impacts, the main impact of closing down our borders is the effect that it has on our tourism industry. Australia also has a very large airline industry, and all of these flights that are currently grounded. Talk to us about some of the economic impacts that Australia has seen after closing its borders.
Well, obviously, like Fiji, we're an economy that is heavily reliant on tourism, both international and domestic, and that's come to a grinding halt. But as I said earlier, had we not closed our borders, the impact of COVID-19, including the economic impact, would have been much more severe. So it's our hope that we will emerge more quickly from COVID-19 by having moved so quickly and decisively at the outset. And I would assume the same is the case for Fiji.
Well, in the course of discussion, allow me to digress just a little bit. We've seen stories that have been done by international media about certain airline workers and also people who used to work in the airports, especially a few pilots who had been working in the industry for decades, who have now had to resort to being traffic controllers in Australia. With this travel bubble being opened, of course, it's not just the travel that needs to be facilitated. There's more reabsorbing those who have lost their jobs or who have been made redundant. How do you foresee, or in your own opinion, how do you see this happening again? You know, how do you see them coming back into work and getting back into the job that they had before?
Well, you're very right. There's no doubt that the airline industry across the world has been very severely impacted by this, including in Australia. And I think once domestic travel starts, in my case in Australia, and then international travel, these people will of course come back to their jobs, but it will be demand driven. So when there's a demand for flights, pilots, aircrew will naturally come back. But the impact on the airline industry is very severe, and there are international airlines which probably won't survive.
While speaking to the press earlier this month, you mentioned that there's no timeline, and as you said earlier, it's in really early stages. There's months of work that has to go into finalizing this bilateral agreement. But once finalized, just as even as a general answer, what do you think that this agreement will look like, or what is Australia seeking to prioritize out of this agreement?
It's too early to say what the agreement will look like, but our priority will be the public health of both Fijians and Fiji and Australians. So everything we do will be driven through that lens, or look through that lens. Our priority will be protecting Fijians and protecting Australians who travel here, and vice versa.
So I mean, it seems like the crux of the matter is the protection of Fijians while allowing travelling.
Yeah, and vice versa, absolutely.
Stay with us, we'll come back after a short break. So getting back into the discussion, let's talk about the pandemic itself and the way it's unfolded in Australia. According to our research, Australian government, in fact the Australian government website reports a little over 7,000 confirmed cases so far, with 100 deaths and nearly 6,500 people recovered. In your opinion, how do you think the Australian government has handled the pandemic back at home?
Well, it probably won't surprise you that I will say that I think they've handled it very well, and I'm talking both about our Commonwealth government and our state governments. And in fact, one of the unique approaches that we've adopted is the Prime Minister has convened a national cabinet, which involves both the federal government or Commonwealth government and the states, all of the states, and the level of cooperation has been extraordinary. Political differences have been put aside for the good of Australians. Like Fiji, we moved quickly and we moved decisively to put in place measures in terms of border closures, social distancing, quarantine, and that has kept the numbers relatively low. There were forecasts when COVID-19 first emerged that hundreds of thousands of Australians would be infected, and that hasn't come to pass. And I think largely that's because of the decisive response by Australian governments collectively, Commonwealth and state.
How you think the Fiji government and the Fiji people had handled the COVID-19 pandemic so far. As we record right now, we've only got 3 active cases, and we've had at least, I think, 34 days of no cases that have come up. In relation to, I can understand with the population, in Fiji and in Australia, it's vastly different, but the way that it's being handled, do you think Fiji's done a good job so far?
Yeah, I do, and there are similarities to the way in which both governments have responded. I mean, Fiji moved again decisively and quickly to shut its borders. It was criticised for doing so, but it's been proven right. They moved very quickly to implement social isolation measures. They move quickly to quarantine people. They move quickly to impose curfews. And the contact tracing has been second to none. So I think Fiji's done a very good job, and that's not just my opinion, but it's the opinion of all of my diplomatic colleagues that I speak to, and the international organisations like the World Health Organisation.
Mm-hmm.
For Australia to return to normal, because as I understand, Australians are there are still restrictions in place. Could you tell us a bit more about what Australia's planning? Because, I mean, the evidence seems to suggest that the restrictions and all of the measures implemented are working. The curve has certainly flattened. There are very less cases coming up now. For Australia to come back to normal, what needs to happen?
Well, the decisions on how the restrictions are going to be lifted or reduced is one for state governments, and so different states will take different approaches. We are already seeing in some states the opening up of restaurants and pubs and parks and things like that to limited groups of people. Other states are hanging on to those restrictions for a little longer. So really people are proceeding cautiously, again looking at things through this public health lens. And I think all governments, whether it's the Commonwealth or the state governments, are very cognisant that we don't want a second wave to emerge.
Mm-hmm. Just a quick question on what's been happening with repatriation of Australian citizens into and out of Australia. Some people have asked questions, well, you know, what's going on with those that have been brought back into Australia? Are they entering quarantine facilities? Are they being screened? Is the same stringent measures being followed and the protocols being followed in Australia as what we might have in Fiji?
Yeah, the quarantine measures are very similar. I mean, 14 days in a hotel here, 14 days in a hotel in Australia, no exemptions. So it doesn't matter whether you're Australian, Fijian or Albanian. You go into a hotel for 14 days, you're tested at the point of release, and if you're not cleared, then you remain in quarantine.
Mm-hmm. And contact tracing is still being done?
Contact tracing, absolutely. And the government's asked Australians to download an application to facilitate contact tracing, and indeed it's the same app that will be used here. It's from Singapore.
Mm-hmm.
So contact tracing and testing has been critical.
Mm-hmm.
Ever since its introduction, I believe it's called the COVID Safe app,
yeah.
right? How many? Would you be able to tell us how many Australians have downloaded it so far?
It's many millions.
Right.
Yeah. I think it's like 5 or 6.
Just on a personal note, you're away from your family at this point in time. You're here in Fiji and your family is in Australia. You haven't been able to see them. What are your personal thoughts on that? Do you think that you'll be able to see them once the travel bubble is opened up, or would you be waiting until, you know, things quieten down a little bit more?
Well, that's the $64,000 question that my wife and I talk about every night. I don't want to focus on my personal circumstances because I know there are so many people who are doing it much tougher than I. But yes, I'm not 100% sure when we'll see each other again. But again, you know, I'm very conscious I have a job. I'm healthy. My family's healthy. So I'm reasonably comfortable about that.
Stay with us. We'll be back after a short break. We'd like to discuss in this segment some of the economic issues that are surrounding the COVID-19 pandemic, especially here at home in Fiji. But first, let's talk about the way that the Australian High Commission coordinated its response after Tropical Cyclone Harold. So
we've provided about 12 million Fiji dollars to the Fiji government for TC cyclone relief, and that's a combination of goods, you know, tents, chainsaws, mosquito nets, medicines, but also we've provided some top-up payments for the social security system, and we are in further discussions with the government about expanding that, so we'll have an announcement on that shortly. On COVID-19, as you're probably aware, I signed with the Attorney General an agreement, a historic agreement, I think it was last week, to provide direct budget support to the Fiji government. And in addition to that financial support, we've provided testing equipment or tests, PPE equipment, and things like that.
So it's interesting. So the injection was of $17 million in direct
Fiji,
budget support. But I'm interested in knowing why direct budget support.
Well, it's our view that the Fiji government knows best where to spend the money that we're providing, and we're entirely confident that it will be well spent and go to those areas which need it most. It's also much more efficient way of delivering aid.
Let's look at some of the economic fallouts of COVID-19. We've seen, of course, the tourism industry take a major hit, and for a developing nation like Fiji, it doesn't necessarily cripple you, but it does put you at a standstill. In a moment like that, for a country like Australia to step in to help out in those sorts of circumstances is something that is, of course, greatly appreciated. But talk to us about what happened in Australia from the beginning until now. How do you see Australia coping with the COVID-19 economic pandemic and also the fallout of it?
Well, I think it's important for both countries not to be despondent. I mean, I'd see this as a very serious episode, but both countries, both economies will rebound. I've got absolute confidence in that. Australia, like Fiji, has taken a big economic hit. I mean, the global growth forecasts issued by the IMF have been wound back significantly, and there's no getting away from that. But I'm optimistic that both economies will rebound. I mean, in both places, the economic fundamentals are strong and robust. I don't want to underplay the impact, particularly on people's lives, but looking to the future, I am confident about both Fiji and Australia emerging from this.
So besides the direct budget support, you've also been in talks with stakeholders about where aid should be focused or where aid should be directed. So talk to us about that and what's been the subject of these discussions.
Listen, it is just about ensuring that whatever we provide meets Fijian government priorities. So we don't want to be doing anything that is not a priority for the Fiji government. Our aid program needs to be demand-driven, and so it's just really fine-tuning some of what we're doing. Obviously, given COVID-19 and TC Harold, we've pivoted towards those two emergencies, and that's where our focus has been. But over the longer term, we will have a discussion with the Fiji government about ensuring that the assistance that we provide meets its priorities.
Well, with COVID-19, something that's very close to our hearts that I don't think a lot of people have been discussing quite openly is sports. And of course, just recently, I think about a month or so ago, we saw not necessarily a travel bubble being opened up, but there was this one case where the New Zealand Warriors, the rugby team, had flown into Australia, and there was some concern about the players coming in and leaving two of their players behind because they failed the screening. And those that had gone into Australia had gone into quarantine, and then they had to go for all sorts of screenings and all of that. And there were people that were questioning, why is it that, sports is being prioritized at a particular point in time where public health and safety should be the utmost importance. But then there's also financial setbacks that come in, especially with those major league clubs, because of all the sponsorship and all the money that it brings in. If you were to talk to us about trying to get back to that level, especially since quite a lot of remittance comes back into Fiji with sports, what would you say?
Well, I think the National Rugby League has been very careful to ensure that it can resume its season, a truncated season, without raising any public health risks. Hence the quarantine of not only the New Zealand team, but all of the Australian teams are required to enter a sort of hotel bubble with regular testing. And of course they'll be playing in front of, with no crowds, which is an extraordinary situation. But I think it's massively important for Australia and for Fiji that life begins to return to normal as quickly as possible. And for both of our countries, for both countries, sport is an integral part of who we are. So I think it's a great thing that the National Rugby League is going to start its season. I'm hopeful that there'll be a domestic rugby union competition up and running shortly. I know New Zealand will have one as well. And you're right, Fiji has made a massive contribution to all of the football codes in Australia, not only rugby union but rugby league and indeed the AFL. So we pay tribute to the contribution they've made. And I might take this opportunity just to say that not only has the Fijian diaspora made a huge contribution in sport, but you know, when I go to Sydney and meet with the Fijian community there, they're the leaders of business in the legal professions and medical professions in local government. So the Fijian community as a whole has made an enormous contribution, positive contribution to Australia. Of course, your sporting stars are the ones who are best known, and maybe that's as it should be.
Stay with us, we'll be back after a short break. So there's been talks about sports resuming behind closed doors without any audience. And I think it was one of the European leagues, Bundesliga, that resumed in such a way. And it was really strange to, I guess, miss the crowd. What do you think sports will look like without audiences? And how do you ensure that there's still money in the game?
That's a very good question. I think some players undoubtedly will have difficulty motivating themselves, although I suspect once the game is underway, those doubts will evaporate. In terms of the revenue, a lot of the revenue is generated by television rights, and so that revenue stream will continue. Of course, they won't. None of the football codes will get the spectator. The revenue that comes from spectators. I really don't know. I mean, let's wait and see. I can't imagine how it will play out. It will be a very different feel to it, no doubt.
So this is our final segment, and we'd like to talk about, I guess, the future outlook for some of the aid work or some of the work that's going into supporting the government here in Fiji, especially for the Australian High Commission. So, of course, because of the COVID-19 pandemic, you must have had to, I guess, reassess what your aid or what your support looks like in the coming years or in the coming few months. Could you talk to us about that?
Yeah, well, as I said earlier, we're in discussions with the government to make sure that the aid that we provide is focused on those areas that are of major priority to the government. I suspect once we get over the immediate emergency response stemming from both TC Harold and COVID, we'll be looking at measures to stimulate the economy, or not stimulate the economy, but support businesses get through this. We're still in very early stages of discussion, but there's no doubt that our aid program will have to pivot, or will pivot, to meet what is the new reality. And foremost amongst that will be ensuring that Fiji gets through economically this as quickly as possible.
Because a lot of it also, I guess, comes from the way that the federal government in Australia prioritizes its foreign aid, right? And how much of its budget it allocates towards foreign aid, right?
Yeah. So. Although other parts of the aid budget have been reduced, the allocation to the Pacific has not. In fact, it's been increased. So the government is prioritising the Pacific. The Pacific is front and centre of our foreign policy approach. And both the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, and my Minister, Senator Payne, are very clear in their determination to prioritise the Pacific. And as you would have seen I mean, the PM visited Fiji twice last year. Of course, Prime Minister Bainimarama visited for a state visit in September last year, and my Minister, Senator Payne, I think must have visited here at least 3 times last year. So the Pacific remains the centrepiece of what we're doing.
So John, let's look at something that quite a lot of people have been asking questions about, you know, staying at home, especially during quarantine or lockdown. A lot of Fijians have been thinking, man, I really need to travel. I need to get out of this place. I want to go visit family. I want to visit friends. I just need to get out of here. And of course, Australia and New Zealand are basically the number 1 and number 2 choices. In terms of Australia, we've had a couple of people ask us questions like they had lodged in their visas before COVID-19 pandemic took place in Fiji, at least with the outbreak. And unfortunately, because they weren't able to travel, they, of course, would maybe not be able to get their visa application fee refunded. But what happens with the travel dates? For example, if they had intended travel in April or in May, and we're coming towards the end of May, and maybe their visas had been granted, or if they haven't, if you could clarify that. And also, what happens later on? Will they be given an extension on the dates that they could travel if they wish to travel once the travel bubble opens up?
Yeah, I should make one thing clear. We have facilitated quite a bit of travel by Fijians to Australia on compassionate and medical grounds and family grounds. So people are still travelling. Visas are still being processed, but this is new territory for us all. I think we'll be very keen to ensure that no one's disadvantaged by the delay in being able to travel, and we're looking at a whole range of measures, including credits, obviously.
So if I were to say, for example, probably look at travelling, I would have to wait for a while, of course, because right now for anyone that is travelling to Australia, they're still being put into quarantine, and then they'll be dispersed to wherever it is that they have to go.
Yeah, I mean, there are no scheduled passenger flights between Australia and Fiji at the moment, so there are effectively no flights. So travel is very difficult at the moment. But yes, it's as I said at the outset, the quarantine arrangements remain in place, both here and in Fiji.
Let's look at some lighter things. Of course, what with COVID-19, the workplace dynamics have had to change. With the Australian High Commission, of course, there's quite a lot of diplomatic work that needs to be done in person and having to adapt to this particular nature of office work. How has it been for you?
Well, I think like all of us, we've adapted the way in which we operate. Many of our staff returned to Australia, so we're down to a skeleton staff. All of our families returned. We're making use of the technology. But in recent times, I've started again with the appropriate social distancing measures in place to meet with my Fijian counterparts. I met with the Attorney General, and of course Jonathan Kerr, my New Zealand counterpart, and I met with the Minister for Trade. So slowly work is beginning to return to normal, although as we said before while we were off camera, I think there will be some quite fundamental changes to the way in which offices around the world operate. Ziad, you were mentioning that you found it quite effective working from home. Well, that's been our experience as well.
Well, it's been great having you here. Thank you so much for joining us this evening, and we really hope to see some positive news coming out of that Trans-Tasman Bubble.
Yeah, well, thank you both very much for having me, and I too look forward to the days in which Australian and New Zealand tourists can visit this wonderful country again.
And that's all we have for you on the show tonight. Thank you for joining us. Have a good evening.